The Pacific Northwest could soon face a power shortage. The report warns about the possibility of rolling blackouts next year. Seattle guy Jason Rance joining me now. What's with the blackouts, Jason? Don't tell me it's green policy's gone wrong. Is that right?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the case. Spoiler alert, that's what this is. I mean, Washington State in particular has done everything that it has been able to go away from natural gas and push electricity. And the problem is we don't have the infrastructure in place that could handle any kind of increase, massive increase in demand, especially at a time in which there is some sort of cold snap. We've banned natural gas in new construction. We've closed natural gas and coal plants with no replacement for them. We've been trying to weirdly breach the Snake River dams, which provide hydropower, which is clean and represents about 60% of our electric grid here in Washington State. And so what essentially they're saying is the demand that's going to be put in place because of policies, there is a resource gap in energy, which is basically about the size that would power all of Oregon State. So that's what we're essentially missing moving forward.
Whoa, that's a lot of missing juice.
The unthinkable has just happened. For decades, Europe powered its industries, homes, and influence with imported energy, controlling pipelines, oil routes, and trade systems from Africa to the Middle East. But in 2025, that dominance flipped overnight. Across Africa, a quiet revolution is turning the tables on the global energy order. New alliances, new technologies, and new trade laws have just shattered Western control of one of the world's most valuable resources, energy. And as Europe faces its worst energy shock in 40 years, African nations are not just surviving the crisis, they're profiting from it. This is how Africa just flipped the global energy market. It began with a simple but powerful idea spreading from Abuja to Nairobi to Addis Ababa. Why should Africa export crude energy when it can export finished power? For decades, Africa supplied raw oil, gas, and minerals to foreign companies, only to buy back refined fuel at double the price. That colonial-era system, controlled by Western corporations, made billions, but left African economies in the dark. Now, that's changing fast. In 2024 and 2025, major African economies, Nigeria, Angola, Tanzania, Ghana, and Algeria, passed sweeping energy sovereignty laws, requiring that a majority of all extracted resources be refined, processed, or distributed within Africa. Foreign companies suddenly found themselves locked out or forced to partner under new African-led terms. At the same time, renewable energy investment exploded across the continent. Morocco launched the world's largest solar complex. Kenya achieved 95% renewable power capacity. And South Africa's new green hydrogen corridor began exporting clean fuel directly to Asia. For the first time in modern history, Africa controls not just its oil, but its energy narrative. When Africa moved to control its energy exports, Europe dismissed it as symbolic. But then came the shock. Within months, African nations began redirecting major energy shipments away from Europe and toward Asia. China and India signed multi-billion-dollar long-term contracts, offering higher prices and fewer political conditions. The results were immediate. European gas imports from Africa dropped by 43%. Refinery output in Italy and France plunged. Energy bills across the EU tripled in just 6 months. Meanwhile, headlines screamed of rolling blackouts and energy rationing. Factories slowed down, inflation spiked, and Europe's leaders scrambled to negotiate. But this time, Africa wasn't begging for deals, it was setting the terms. African trade ministers now demanded fair pricing, technology transfers, and regional investment before renewing export contracts. Europe, once the buyer with leverage, suddenly found itself powerless. And in the background, a new trade corridor emerged, linking African oil, Asian refining, and Middle Eastern logistics into a unified energy bloc that bypassed Western systems entirely. The next phase of the power shift came quietly and permanently. As European demand collapsed, Asia stepped in. Beijing, New Delhi, and Jakarta moved fast to secure long-term supply chains with African states. Together, they launched the Africa-Asia Energy Corridor, a $900 billion initiative connecting ports, refineries, and renewable grids from Lagos to Mumbai. This corridor does more than trade oil. It trades influence. Chinese engineers built pipelines across East Africa. Indian companies co-invested in solar manufacturing in Ghana. And African governments gained something they never had before: strategic options. They were no longer dependent on the IMF or World Bank to fund their energy transitions. Instead, they turned east, where loans came with fewer political strings and faster results. By mid-2025, Africa had become the centerpiece of the world's fastest-growing energy network. And Europe? Its policymakers now admit privately they underestimated Africa's rise. As one leaked EU briefing put it, Africa has achieved in 2 years what Europe took 4 decades to build: total energy independence. This isn't just about oil or gas or even solar energy. It's about power in every sense of the word. Africa is now defining the global rules of trade, energy, and diplomacy. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, has evolved into a continental supply chain, linking 1.4 billion people under a single economic framework. And as the world enters a new industrial era, powered by lithium, cobalt, hydrogen, and AI-driven grids, Africa sits at the center of it all. European and American corporations are now forced to negotiate with African unions, not dictate to them. And the West's era of cheap African energy is officially over. But this shift also brings new challenges. Energy nationalism is rising. Competition between African and Asian firms is heating up, and questions remain. Can Africa sustain this independence without falling into new forms of dependency? One thing is certain: the world can no longer ignore the continent it once called emerging. Because today, it's Africa, not the West, that's emerging as the energy superpower. The lights that once powered Europe now shine brightest over Africa. And as the global map of power redraws itself, one truth echoes through every corridor of trade and diplomacy. Africa didn't just join the energy race. It changed the rules entirely. This is Africa's energy revolution, and the world is finally catching up.